Margaret Ose had been reviewing payroll reconciliation files for exactly 47 minutes when the CFO's assistant knocked on her office door and told her that Director Havorson wanted to see her before end of day. Margaret set down her pen. She did not look up from the spreadsheet immediately. She let the number she had just found sit in her mind for a moment, the way you let a burn cool before you touch it again. Then she closed the laptop, straightened her badge, Operations Manager, Harwick Financial Group, Building C, 4th floor, and said she would be there at 4:30. She had been in this building for 9 years. She knew where every file lived. What none of them had thought about, when they handed her the access credentials for the full payroll system as part of her new role, was that she had spent 9 years watching. 9 years of quarterly reviews where she was told her salary was market appropriate. 9 years of annual performance ratings that said exceeds expectations in every category, followed by merit increases of 2 and 3%. 9 years of watching newer employees hired at numbers she had been told were simply unavailable. She had pulled the data that morning. All of it. Every salary record going back to the year she was hired. She found what she expected to find. And then she found something she had not expected, which was considerably worse. She had not called the CFO yet. She was going to. But first she needed to understand exactly what she was looking at, because when she made that call, she intended to control every word of the conversation. I controlled the correction. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told that your years of work meant nothing, that your loyalty had no value, that the system simply did not owe you what you had earned, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because what I am about to tell you took 9 years to build and about 11 minutes to say out loud, and I want you to know that timing matters more than volume. But to understand why that morning meant what it did, I have to take you back, 14 years back, to a kitchen table in a house that is no longer standing, and a conversation that I have replayed more times than I can count. I was 26 years old. I had just been offered a position as a junior data analyst at a mid-sized logistics company called Brayburn Consolidated on the eastern edge of the city. The salary was $41,000. It was not extraordinary, but it came with benefits, a structured review cycle, and more importantly, it came with access to systems, to reporting, to the kind of operational visibility that I had spent 2 years in a certificate program learning to read. I had worked for that program while holding down a full-time job at a shipping warehouse, taking classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and all-day Saturday for 18 months. I had graduated with honors. I had the letter, I had the offer. I brought it to the table because I thought, genuinely believed at 26 that the people sitting around that table would want to see it. My stepfather, Roland Vickers, read the offer letter the way someone reads a document they have already decided to dismiss. He set it face down on the table. He said, $41,000, that's what you're celebrating. It was not a question. My mother, Patricia Vickers, said nothing. She had been saying nothing on my behalf for so long by then that her silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was the look on my older stepbrother Garrett's face, a slow, deliberate kind of amusement, like he was watching someone trip on a step he had deliberately left uneven. Data analysis, Garrett said, for a shipping company. He looked at Roland. I mean, good for her. Roland pulled a folder from the stack of papers he always kept near his chair. He slid it across the table to me. Inside was a printout from a banking website, a mortgage refinancing offer, terms already outlined, 2 pages requiring co-signature. We need $48,000, he said. Equity withdrawal. The house needs a new roof and your mother's car needs to be replaced. You're working now, full-time. I looked at the number, $48,000. I had not yet received a single paycheck from the job I had just been offered. I said I didn't have $48,000. Roland said, you have a salary now, you have credit. You co-sign, the bank processes the loan, we handle the payments. He said it the way people describe a transaction that has already been agreed to. This is how families work, Margaret, you contribute. I asked about the inheritance. My biological father, David Osei, had passed 3 years earlier and had left a small amount, $23,500, in a modest account that Roland had told me at the time would be held in trust until I turned 25. I was 26. I had never seen those funds. When I asked about them directly, Roland said the money had been applied to household expenses during the years I lived there after my father died. He said I was welcome to review the accounting if I wanted to make it complicated. Garrett laughed. Not loudly, just enough. My mother said, "Margaret, please don't make this difficult." I did not co-sign the loan. I left the table. I left the house that night with 2 bags and a number of things I have never fully put into words. I stayed with a woman I had met in my certificate program, a quiet and generous person named Doreen Ashby, who gave me the couch in her apartment for 6 weeks and never once asked me to explain myself. I did not argue with Roland about the $23,500. I did not hire anyone. I did not make demands. I did not send letters. I wrote down 3 things on a piece of paper that night while Doreen was asleep. The first was the name of an attorney I had seen listed in a financial planning article. The second was the number $23,500. The third was a phrase I had underlined in a textbook the previous semester. Operational leverage is the ability to convert fixed process knowledge into scalable institutional power. I folded the paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. The first year at Brayburn Consolidated was harder than I had expected, and I had expected it to be hard. Junior analysts at that company were treated as a necessary inconvenience, present enough to complete the work that no one more senior wanted to touch, invisible enough to be excluded from the decisions that work informed. I processed freight reconciliation reports. I audited vendor invoices. I identified 3 separate billing discrepancies in my first 4 months that saved the company a combined $17,000 and received a thank you email from my direct supervisor, Carl Beaumont, and nothing else. I applied for an internal promotion at 8 months. It was the analyst II role, a modest step up, but it came with access to a different tier of the company's financial reporting system, and that access was what I actually wanted. The application was returned with a form letter indicating that the position had been filled by an external candidate. I found out 3 weeks later that the external candidate had 18 months of total professional experience. I had equivalent experience plus the completed certificate. I had scored higher on the internal assessment. I went to Carl Beaumont's office and asked him, directly, what the selection criteria had been. Carl was a decent man in a limited way, decent enough to look uncomfortable, not decent enough to give me a full answer. He said the hiring committee had prioritized someone with a specific background in freight forward billing systems. I said I had completed coursework in that exact area. He said he knew. He said, "Margaret, sometimes these things aren't purely about qualification." I thanked him and left. I almost left the company that month. I had found a posting at a regional accounting firm, Whitfield Partners, downtown, that was hiring for a junior financial operations role at $44,500. I filled out the application. I wrote the cover letter. I got to the point of scheduling the phone screen. Then something happened that I have thought about often in the years since. I was in the Brayburn system late one evening finishing a reconciliation poll, and I found an error in the payroll export file, a duplication in the deduction columns for 11 employees that, if it had gone unnoticed, would have resulted in incorrect W-2 filings. It was not my assignment. I was not supposed to be in that part of the system. But I found it, I documented it. I wrote a formal memo to the finance director, Sylvia Marchetti, with a corrected file attached. Sylvia Marchetti called me into her office the next morning. She was a tall woman with very short silver hair and the kind of attention that felt like being lit by a focused lamp. She read my memo. She looked at the corrected file. She asked me 3 technical questions, precise, without preamble. I answered all 3 correctly. She said, "Who taught you to format an error memo like this?" I told her the certificate program. I mentioned Doreen Ashby's name because it was Doreen who had first shown me the proper documentation protocol. Sylvia wrote something down. She said, "I'm going to get you moved to financial operations reporting. It'll take a month. Don't go anywhere." I canceled the Whitfield Partners phone screen. I did not tell my family. My mother called twice that month, once to relay a message from Roland about some tax documents he needed my signature on, once to ask whether I was attending Garrett's birthday dinner. I said I was unavailable both times. I did not explain why. There was nothing to explain yet, and I had learned, by then, that explaining yourself to people who are not listening is a form of performance, not communication. Sylvia moved me to financial operations reporting in 6 weeks, not 4. She also quietly arranged for my title to be adjusted retroactively to Analyst II, effective the date of my original application. She never mentioned it directly. I found it in the system one Tuesday morning, and sat with it for a long moment before I said anything to anyone. The health insurance coverage that came with the Analyst II classification included a mental health rider that the junior analyst tier did not carry. I enrolled in therapy sessions for the first time that winter. I went every other week for 11 months. It cost me a $20 copay each visit, and it was, without question, the most operationally useful thing I did that year. In the spring of my third year at Brayburn, Sylvia Marchetti told me about a workforce analytics certification program run jointly by the Kessler Institute of Applied Management and a consortium of regional employers who co-funded placements for high-performing mid-level analysts. The program took 18 months. It ran on a hybrid schedule, 2 evenings a week and 1 Saturday per month. It was selective. Sylvia said she would write my recommendation letter herself. She also said, in the way she said important things, which was quietly and without looking up from her desk, "You're going to need this if you want to go where you're clearly trying to go, and you clearly know where you're trying to go." I applied. I was accepted. Cohort 9 of the Kessler Workforce Analytics Program, 14 participants, drawn from 7 companies across 3 industries. The program began on a Tuesday evening in September, and the first session was 3 hours of the most intellectually rigorous discussion I had encountered since my undergraduate statistics course. One of the other participants in Cohort 9 was a man named Terrence Ogilvy, who worked in human resources for a regional hospital network. He had been in the field for 11 years and had the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from watching systems from the inside long enough to understand why they fail. Terrence and I ended up as lab partners for the compensation analysis module, which was the most technically demanding section of the program. We worked well together. We argued productively. He taught me how to read a salary banding document with the kind of skepticism it deserves, which is to say, with the assumption that every number in it is a negotiated political artifact and not an objective market reflection. I thought about Roland handing me that mortgage refinancing folder. I thought about the word market appropriate, which had been said to me multiple times by multiple HR representatives over 3 years, each time as though it were a terminal condition. I filed that thought. I did not act on it yet. In the 14th month of the Kessler program, we were required to complete a capstone project, a full compensation equity audit for a real organization, using anonymized data provided by one of the consortium companies. I chose a dataset from a mid-sized financial services firm. I spent 6 weeks on the analysis. I found a statistically significant pay disparity across gender lines in the firm's operations division, a gap averaging $7,200 per year for comparable roles, after controlling for tenure, performance rating, and department. I built the report. I prepared the presentation. The program director, Dr. Annika Brandt, said it was the most technically complete capstone she had reviewed in 4 cohorts. She asked if she could use it, anonymized, as a teaching case for future cohorts. I said yes. I received my Kessler certification on a Friday evening in March. There was a small reception afterward with coffee and a tray of sandwich triangles. I stood by the window for a while after the formal part ended and looked at the city. I was 30 years old. I had $4,200 in savings, a certification, a second-tier analyst title, and a mental map of every compensation system I had ever touched. I did not call my mother that night. I had not spoken to Roland in 2 years. Garrett had sent me a text message 4 months earlier that said, "Mom says you're doing some kind of classes, good luck with that." I had read it, then set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and gone back to my capstone data. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The offer from Harwick Financial Group came through a recruiter named Joseph Tanaka, whom I had met at an operational analytics symposium hosted by the Kessler Alumni Network. Joseph was not a flashy person. He wore the same type of navy blazer every time I saw him, which was 3 times before he called me, and he listened more than he spoke, which I considered a reliable indicator of professional seriousness. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon in late October and said he had a mid-level operations role at Harwick that he thought I should look at. The role was operations analyst, senior track. Harwick Financial Group was a financial services firm with approximately 340 employees, strong regional presence, and a payroll system that was, according to Joseph, in need of someone who could read it without being coached through it. The salary was $67,000. The benefits package included a health insurance coverage tier that covered specialist appointments with no referral requirement, which mattered to me because I had been managing a recurring back problem since a warehouse injury years earlier, and the specialist appointment cycle under my current policy required 4 steps I found maddening. I asked Joseph 2 questions. What was the trajectory for the role, and who would I be reporting to? He said the trajectory was clear. The company had identified operations as a growth area, and the person they hired would be expected to grow with it. He said I would be reporting to the director of operations, a woman named Helen Draper, who had been with Harwick for 11 years and was known internally as someone who protected her people. I took the meeting. I met Helen Draper. She was direct in a way that I found immediately legible. She said what she meant. She expected you to say what you meant in return, and she had no patience for people who mistook busyness for productivity. We talked for an hour and a half. At the end, she said, "You already understand the problem we're trying to solve. That's unusual." I started at Harwick 3 weeks later. The first 2 years were a process of learning the company's specific grammar, the way its systems talked to each other, where the gaps were, which reports were trusted, and which were performed. I embedded myself in the payroll processing cycle in my 4th month, not because it was assigned to me, but because I had noticed that the reconciliation between the HR system and the payroll export had a recurring error pattern that nobody had formally documented. I documented it. I wrote a process note. I sent it to Helen. Helen forwarded it to the CFO, a man named Douglas Fairweather, with one line of her own. "This is Margaret Osai. She found this in month 4. Douglas Fairweather sent me an email that said, "Come talk to me sometime." I made an appointment for the following Thursday. I brought a 1-page summary of 3 additional reconciliation vulnerabilities I had identified. He read it in 4 minutes, looked up and said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "My whole career." He said, "We should be using you better." That conversation did not immediately change my title or my compensation. It did something more durable. It established a direct line of communication between me and the executive level that bypassed the standard organizational hierarchy. Helen knew about it. She had, I realized later, engineered it. She told me once, over coffee in the break room in my 3rd year, "Douglas listens to numbers. Show him numbers he hasn't seen before and he'll listen to whoever's showing them." I showed him numbers, quarter after quarter. I built a financial disclosure reporting template that the company adopted company-wide by my 4th year. I caught an insurance policy misclassification in the benefits administration data that had been generating incorrect premium deductions for 22 employees over a period of 18 months. A total error of $31,400 that, once corrected, was refunded in full to those employees. I flagged a vendor contract that had auto-renewed at an escalated rate without proper authorization review, a $94,000 annual liability that was renegotiated within 60 days. My annual reviews continued to say exceeds expectations. My salary continued to move in increments of 2 and 3%. In my 6th year, I sat down with my financial advisor, a careful and methodical woman named Sandra Kowalski, to review my retirement savings trajectory and discuss whether it made sense to put a portion of my monthly surplus into an investment property fund that her firm was offering to select clients. Sandra laid out the projections. She showed me the equity growth model. She asked me about my college fund planning horizon, which at that point was theoretical. I didn't have children, but she said it was worth thinking about the structural logic of long-term capital allocation, regardless of the specific vehicle. I told her I thought my salary was suppressing my savings rate in a way that was not consistent with my contribution level at work. Sandra looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Do you have documentation of that?" I said I was working on it. I had by then been quietly building a personal record of every performance review, every merit increase, every compensation conversation, and every comparable salary figure I had encountered through professional networks, the Kessler Alumni Group, and industry survey data that Terrence Ogilvy, who had become one of my most trusted colleagues and friends, periodically shared with me from his HR research sources. I had a folder on my personal drive that I updated every 6 months. I had not shown it to anyone. I had not filed any formal complaint. I had not contacted a family law attorney or an estate attorney because this was a workplace matter, not a legal one, or at least, that was what I believed at the time. The promotion offer came on a Thursday morning in my ninth year, delivered by Helen Draper in her office with Douglas Fairweather present. Operations Manager. Full payroll system access as part of the role's administrative scope. Responsibility for the annual payroll reconciliation cycle, beginning immediately. Helen handed me the offer letter. I read it. The salary was $89,000. I did not show what I felt. I said I would review it and respond by end of day Friday. That evening I called Terrence Ogilvy. I told him about the role. I told him about the salary. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who knows what a number means before they say anything about it, "Margaret, what does their payroll data say comparable operations manager roles are paying right now?" I said I didn't have access yet. He said, "Get access first." I accepted the promotion Monday morning. Full access to the payroll system was granted by it at 9:17 a.m. on a Wednesday. By 10:04 a.m. I had pulled every salary record in the company going back 9 years. By 10:47 a.m. I had found what I expected. By 11:15 a.m. I had found what I had not expected. There were two junior analysts, both hired within the last 18 months, both with fewer than 3 years of total professional experience, drawing base salaries of $72,000 and $74,000 respectively. Comparable to my own salary at the time of my promotion offer, within a range that made the comparison self-evident. There was a mid-level operations coordinator, hired 4 years ago, earning $81,000. He had never, to my knowledge, filed a reconciliation report that rose above the standard template. And then there was something else. There was a salary adjustment record dated to my third year, a recommended increase of $14,200 that had been flagged by Sylvia Marchetti, who had evidently consulted with someone at Harwick before I was hired there. The increase had been approved at the director level. It had never been processed. There was no documentation of why. There was only a status field that read, "Deferred pending review." The review date listed was 8 years ago. I sat with that number for a long time. I calculated, without rushing, what $14,200 annually compounded over 8 years, with the merit increases that had been applied to my actual salary rather than the corrected baseline, would have represented in total compensation differential. The number I arrived at was $138,400. I closed the laptop. I straightened my badge. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. I picked up my phone and I scheduled a meeting with Douglas Fairweather for 4:30 p.m. I labeled it, Payroll Reconciliation Review, Initial Findings. Then I opened the laptop again, pulled up a blank document, and began writing the most carefully constructed set of talking points I had ever assembled in my professional life. Because when I walked into that office, I was not going to be surprised by anything. I was going to be the only person in the room who already knew exactly where this was going, and I had waited 9 years to be that person. The meeting with Douglas Fairweather was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. At 4:28 p.m., I was standing in the fourth-floor corridor outside his office, holding a printed copy of my talking points and a USB drive containing the full reconciliation analysis I had built that afternoon. I did not go in early. I stood in the corridor for the full 2 minutes and I breathed, deliberately, the way I had learned to do in therapy sessions during that first winter at Braeburn, 4 counts in, hold 4 counts out. I had not used that technique in years. I used it twice in that corridor. Douglas Fairweather was a precise man who kept his office in a state of controlled order. Everything on his desk had a designated position. He noticed when things were out of place. I had observed this over 9 years, and I had used it as a guide for how to present information to him. Clearly labeled, logically sequenced, nothing buried, nothing obscured. I set the printed document on the desk in front of him at 4:31 p.m. and said, "Before we discuss the reconciliation findings, I need to flag something I discovered in the historical payroll records this morning. I want to make sure I'm understanding the data correctly before I draw any conclusions." Douglas looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, "Sit down, Margaret." I sat down. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He stopped at the third, which contained the salary comparison table and the deferred adjustment record from 8 years ago. He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not uncertainty but calculation. He said, How long have you been looking at this? I said. Since 10:04 this morning. He said, and the deferred adjustment. I said, $14,200 annually, compounded over 8 years with applicable merit rate application, produces a differential of approximately $138,400. I can show you the calculation if you'd like to verify it. He looked at the window, then he looked back at me. I didn't know about this, he said. It was not a defense. It was a factual statement, offered with the directness I had come to expect from him. I said, I believe you. That's why I'm here. Because whoever did know about it made a decision that I was never informed of, and I'd like to understand what the company's position is before either of us says anything else. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. Douglas Fairweather said, "Give me 48 hours." I said, "You have until Friday at noon." I stood up, collected my copy of the document, and left his office at 4:51 p.m. In the elevator going down, I called Terrence Ogilvy. I said, "It's worse than the comparison data. There's a suppressed adjustment from year 3, 8 years deferred with no processing record." Terrence was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Margaret, you need to talk to someone with an employment law background before Friday." I already had a name. The name on the paper I had kept in my wallet for 6 years was Alicia Drummond. She had since moved from the General Financial Planning article, where I first encountered her reference to a senior position at a firm called Voss, Drummond and Reyes, a mid-sized practice that handled employment law, contract disputes, and what their website described as compensation equity litigation. I had looked her up periodically over the years, the way you check on a tool you know you will eventually need. I had never called her office. I called it at 6:17 p.m. on the evening after my meeting with Douglas Fairweather. Her assistant said she could do an initial consultation by phone the following Monday. I said I needed something sooner. I explained briefly 9 years of employment, a discovered payroll record showing a suppressed salary adjustment, and a 48-hour window before an executive response. The assistant put me on hold for 90 seconds. When she came back, she said Alicia Drummond could do a 45-minute call Thursday morning at 7:30 a.m. I said that would work. Thursday at 7:30 a.m., I was at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a printed copy of the payroll analysis, and a cup of coffee that I did not drink. Alicia Drummond's voice was calm and technical, and she moved through questions the way a good systems analyst moves through a problem, no wasted motion, every question building toward the next. She asked about the deferred adjustment record, the approval documentation, the status field notation, and whether I had any written communication referencing the adjustment at any point in my 9 years of employment. I said I had my performance review records, all of them, and that none of them referenced the deferred adjustment. She said that was significant. She asked whether I had signed any compensation agreement or arbitration clause at the time of hire. I had. Most people at Harwick had. She said that was not necessarily a barrier, but it was a factor that shaped the strategy. She said, "Margaret, what outcome are you looking for?" I thought about Sandra Kowalski asking me whether I had documentation. I thought about the retirement savings trajectory we had reviewed together, and the investment property discussion, and the way Sandra had looked at me over her reading glasses when I said my salary was suppressing my savings rate. I said, "Full remediation of the suppressed adjustment, retroactive to the date of deferral with interest. A corrected compensation structure going forward. And a formal acknowledgement in writing that the deferral was an institutional error and not a performance-based decision." Alicia Drummond said that's a reasonable set of objectives. She said she would need to review the full payroll records and the original employment documents. She said she could have a preliminary assessment by end of week. She said her firm would send a formal engagement letter. I called Terrence that evening and told him where things stood. He listened. Then he said, "What does Helen know?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Tell her before Friday. She should hear it from you." I thought about that. Helen Draper had protected me in her quiet way for 9 years. She had arranged the Fairweather connection. She had watched my work and confirmed its value with her own credibility. She deserved to hear it from me. I called her Thursday evening at 7:45 p.m. I told her everything: the discovery, the deferred adjustment, the Fairweather meeting, the attorney consultation. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her. When I finished, she said, "I had no idea about the adjustment record." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of someone who has trusted a system that turned out to have a flaw they had not caught. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to know, that's all." She said, "You have my support, document everything." I said, "I have been, for 6 years." The close call came on Friday morning, the day of the Douglas Fairweather response deadline. I was at my desk at 8:45 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. I looked at it. It was Garrett Vickers. The message said, "Heard you got a promotion. Nice. Mom's been trying to reach you. Family situation." Nothing else. No elaboration. No urgency marker beyond the vagueness of the phrase itself. I stared at the message for a moment. There was a file open on my second monitor, the payroll remediation summary I had been refining for the Fairweather meeting. I minimized it. I set the phone face down. I did not respond to Garrett that morning. I noted the message in my personal records file and turned back to the work in front of me. Whatever the family situation was, it could wait until afternoon. Everything could wait until afternoon. Douglas Fairweather's assistant called at 11:42 a.m. and asked if I could come up at 12:15 p.m. I said yes. I walked into his office at 12:14 p.m. Helen Draper was already there, seated to the left of his desk. Beside her was a man I had not met, introduced as Philip Renner, Harwick's general counsel. Philip Renner had the careful posture of a man who had been in many rooms like this one and had learned to give nothing away with his body. Douglas said, "We've completed our preliminary review." He said the deferred adjustment record had been traced to a decision made by a former HR director who had left the company 4 years ago. The deferral had been authorized at the HR director level and had not been escalated to the CFO or general counsel at the time. The current HR director had confirmed there was no performance-based justification documented anywhere in the file. Philip Renner said, "The company's position is that this was an administrative error that should have been identified and corrected. We are prepared to discuss remediation." I said, "I've retained outside counsel. Alicia Drummond of Voss, Drummond and Rays. I'd like all further discussions to include her." Philip Renner wrote down the name without comment. That was the first document. I had 3 more. The family situation Garrett had referenced turned out to be this. My mother, Patricia Vickers, had been diagnosed in March with a moderate cardiac arrhythmia, requiring a specialist appointment with a cardiologist and a likely procedure within the following 60 days. Roland, who was now 67 and had retired 3 years earlier, had discovered that their health insurance coverage had a gap in cardiac specialist coverage that he had not noticed when he selected their insurance policy during Patricia's Medicare supplement enrollment. The procedure would require out-of-pocket costs that their current financial position could not absorb without significant adjustment. The reason Garrett had contacted me was that Roland had asked him to. I did not find this out in stages. Garrett called me on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after his initial text message, and laid it out with the particular brand of aggressive casualness he had always used when he wanted something, as though the request was so obviously reasonable that any hesitation on my part would be the problem. He said Patricia was managing, but the cardiac procedure had been scheduled, and the medical expenses were going to be considerable given the insurance policy shortfall. He said Roland had done the math, and they were looking at approximately $34,000 in out-of-pocket costs after what the health insurance coverage would contribute. He said, "Obviously you're in a better position now than you used to be. The promotion and everything." I said, "I heard about Mom's diagnosis." "I'm glad they caught it." He said, "So you understand the situation." I said, "Tell me what you're asking, Garrett, specifically." There was a pause. Then he said, "Roland was thinking about the inheritance from your father. He said there was always the question of how that was handled, and he thought maybe now that things are settled you might want to revisit it as a family." The inheritance, $23,500, applied to household expenses 16 years ago with no documentation, no accounting, no acknowledgement. Now offered back as a bargaining position. I kept my voice level. I said, "I appreciate you calling. I'm in the middle of something significant at work right now. Give me 2 weeks and I'll be in touch." Garrett said, "2 weeks might be tight with the procedure timeline." I said, "I understand, 2 weeks." I ended the call. I sat with it for approximately 4 minutes. Then I opened my laptop and sent Alicia Drummond an email with the subject line, "Secondary Matter, Family Estate History." I asked whether she handled matters involving undocumented inheritance disbursements and whether that category of claim had a viable statute framework. She responded within 3 hours. She said she did handle such matters. She said the viability depended on documentation, timeline, and jurisdiction. She said we should add 30 minutes to our next scheduled call. She thought she had won. She had 2 more days. The meeting that the Vickers family requested, Roland, Patricia, and Garrett, took place in Roland's living room on a Sunday afternoon in November. I had driven there alone. I had dressed carefully, which is to say simply, a dark blazer, no jewelry beyond my watch, flat shoes. I had brought nothing with me that was visible. Everything I had prepared was either in Alicia Drummond's case files, in the Harwick remediation records, or in my own memory, which had always been more reliable than any room I had entered with the Vickers family. Living room was the same house they had moved to 8 years ago, not the original house where the mortgage conversation had happened, which had indeed been sold. This house was smaller, and the furniture was newer, but the arrangement of people was identical to the one I had grown up navigating. Roland in the large chair to the left of the window. Patricia on the sofa, facing me. Garrett standing near the kitchen doorway, which was his habitual position for conversations where he wanted the option of departure. Roland said, "We appreciate you coming." I said, "Of course." He said, "Patricia's procedure is scheduled for the 14th. We've been in contact with the cardiologist's office about the medical expenses and we have a payment plan discussion scheduled, but the numbers are difficult." He paused. "I want to be straight with you, Margaret. The situation with your father's money, I handled it in a way that wasn't ideal. The accounting wasn't documented the way it should have been." "I understand that." I said, "I appreciate you saying that." He said, "So I'm asking as family for your help with Patricia's medical situation. The insurance policy doesn't cover what it should. The cardiac specialist fees are significant. We're looking at real financial pressure." Patricia said, "Margaret, I know things haven't always been easy between us, but you're in a good position now, you've done well." Garrett said nothing. He was watching me with the same careful attention he had used at the kitchen table 16 years ago, looking for something he could read. I looked at the window, then I looked back at Patricia. I kept my hands flat on the table in front of me. I said, "I hear you, I want to help with Mom's health, that matters to me." I paused. "But I need a few days to review my financial position, and I want any agreement we reach to be documented. I think that's fair to everyone given the history." Roland said, "Documented how?" I said, "In writing, terms clear to both sides. I think you'd agree that's better for all of us." Roland looked at Garrett. Garrett shrugged marginally, which meant he agreed without wanting to be recorded as having agreed. Roland said, "That's reasonable." I said I would be in touch by Wednesday. I drove home. The following morning, I called Alicia Drummond and told her the Vickers family had voluntarily opened a discussion about the inheritance in the context of a financial request. She said that was a significant development. She said it had just simplified a particular jurisdictional question she had been working around. She said, "Can you get to my office Thursday afternoon?" I said yes. What the Vickers family did not know was that Alicia Drummond had already been in contact with Harwick's general counsel, Philip Renner, on an entirely separate matter, and that Philip Renner had, at my request, provided Alicia with a formal letter documenting the payroll remediation agreement that Douglas Fairweather and I had reached the previous week. The remediation figure was $138,400, to be paid in a structured disbursement over 6 months, plus a corrected forward compensation of $103,000 annually, plus a written acknowledgement of institutional error. Signed, dated, witnessed. Terence Ogilvy had been the first person I told when the agreement was finalized. He had been quiet for a moment on the phone, and then he had said, with the careful precision of someone who understands institutional systems, "Margaret, that's extraordinary." He had not meant the money. He had meant the acknowledgement. The written, witnessed, institutional acknowledgement that the error was not mine. I had held the phone and looked out the window of my apartment at the city, which had the particular quality of cities at dusk, lights beginning to come on, shape becoming light, the day turning into something else. I had thought about the paper in my wallet. I had thought about Doreen Ashby's couch, and Sylvia Marchetti's focused attention, and the sandwich triangles at the Kessler reception, and Sandra Kowalski looking at me over her reading glasses, and Terence teaching me how to read a salary banding document with the skepticism it deserved. I had thought about the $23,500. I had not cried, but I had been still for a long time. The Thursday afternoon meeting at Alicia Drummond's office on the 14th floor of the Voss, Drummond and Ray's building, was the first time I had seen her in person. She was a compact, efficient woman in her mid-50s who gave the impression of someone who had been precise her entire life and had found it useful. Her office had 2 windows and a round conference table with 4 chairs. She had a folder in front of her that was organized in the same color-coded system I used for my own financial records, which I noted and considered a good sign. She said, "Before we go through the documents, I want to make sure we're aligned on the objective." I said, "I want the inheritance documented and acknowledged. I want a formal financial disclosure covering the period from my father's death to my 25th birthday. And I want any agreement with the Vickers family regarding Patricia's medical expenses to be separate, documented, and entirely voluntary on my part, not conditioned on anything related to the inheritance." Alicia said, "The inheritance issue is potentially actionable. However, it is old and the documentation is thin. What we have is Roland's verbal admission on Sunday, which you recorded with his knowledge as we discussed, and the absence of any formal trust documents or accounting records, which is itself evidentiary." I said, "He told me there was a trust. When I was 22, he used the word trust specifically." Alicia said, "Then what we have is a verbal representation of trust documents that do not appear to exist, a voluntary acknowledgement that the handling was, quote, not ideal, and a recorded conversation. What I can do with that is draft a formal request for financial disclosure, a letter requiring Roland Vickers to produce accounting records for the period in question within 30 days or acknowledge in writing that none exist." I said, "Do it." She slid the engagement letter across the table. I signed it. She said the financial disclosure request would go out by end of week. She said it was not a court filing, it was a formal legal correspondence that created a documented record. She said, "If he ignores it, we have options. If he responds, we have information. Either way, you are no longer in a position where you have nothing." I left her office at 4:48 p.m. and walked to my car through the November cold. Terrence had texted during the meeting, a single line. "How did it go?" I typed back, "Signed." He responded with a single period. We had worked together long enough that I knew what that meant. It meant good. It meant move forward. It meant, I'm here. The disclosure request letter went to Roland Vickers on a Friday morning, delivered by certified mail with return receipt. By the following Tuesday, Roland had engaged his own attorney, a man named Stephen Burke of a small general practice firm called Burke & Associates, and had sent a response letter through Stephen Burke's office indicating that Roland disputed the characterization of the inheritance handling and wished to resolve the matter through direct family discussion rather than legal correspondence. Alicia Drummond said that was exactly what she expected and that it was a good sign. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon in December, in a conference room on the 15th floor of Voss, Drummond and Ray's. Present, Alicia Drummond on my side of the table, Stephen Burke on Roland's, Roland Vickers and Garrett Vickers seated beside Stephen Burke, and Patricia Vickers, who had insisted on attending despite the cardiologist's recommendation that she limit stress in the weeks following her procedure. She had had the procedure 6 days earlier and was recovering steadily, according to the brief conversation we had had in the hallway before the meeting began, the first direct exchange between my mother and me that had not involved a request in several years. I was the last one into the room. I had timed it that way. When I sat down, Roland looked at me with the expression I had seen him use at the kitchen table 16 years ago, the look of someone who has already decided on the outcome and is managing the formality of arriving at it. Alicia Drummond opened. She stated the purpose of the meeting, to discuss the matter of the inheritance from David Osa, deceased, and to reach a documented resolution that was transparent and formal. She noted that a financial disclosure request had been sent, and that the response had indicated a preference for direct resolution, which was a legitimate approach, and that we were here to pursue it. Stephen Burke said his client's position was that the inheritance funds had been used for household expenses that directly benefited Margaret Osai during her residence in the Vickers household following her father's death, and that the application of those funds had been a reasonable family decision made in good faith. Alicia said, Can you produce documentation of those household expenses? Stephen Burke said his client was in the process of locating records from that period. Alicia said, the disclosure request was sent 31 days ago. You had 30 days to produce documentation. If documentation does not currently exist, I'd ask your client to acknowledge that in this meeting, on the record. Rowland said, to Stephen Burke's visible mild alarm, there are no records. It was 15 years ago. We didn't keep records of household expenses. Garrett looked at Rowland. Stephen Burke made a small gesture with his left hand that meant stop talking. Alicia said, thank you, I want to note that for the record. She opened her folder. She placed a document on the table, a copy of a statement Rowland had made to me on the Sunday in November, transcribed from the recorded conversation. She slid it across to Stephen Burke. This is a transcript of a recorded conversation in which Rowland Vickers stated, and I quote, that the handling of the inheritance was, quote, not ideal, and that the accounting was not documented as it should have been. Your client signed a consent acknowledgement at the beginning of that conversation confirming the recording. Stephen Burke read the transcript. Rowland's expression shifted. Not dramatically. Just by a few degrees, the way a structure shifts when one load-bearing point is removed. Alicia said, that's the first document, I have 3 more. Garrett said very quietly, what are the other 3? Alicia said, the second is a formal record from the estate of David Osai, obtained from the county probate archive, confirming that a testamentary account in the amount of $23,500 was designated for Margaret Osai, with a specified distribution date of her 25th birthday, and that no record of formal trust administration exists in the probate file. This means the funds were either administered informally, without court oversight, or were applied without the legal authority to do so. She placed the document on the table. Patricia Vickers's hands, which had been folded in her lap, went very still. Alicia said, the third document is a letter from Harwick Financial Group's legal office, confirming a payroll remediation settlement reached last month, the details of which are Margaret's private business, but which I mention here because it establishes, formally, that Margaret's professional standing and financial position are entirely self-constructed and entirely independent of any family financial support, past or present. She placed the letter on the table. Rowland looked at it. He did not pick it up. Alicia said, the fourth document is a proposed resolution agreement. It is a single page. It acknowledges the inheritance amount, acknowledges the absence of documentation for its application, proposes a repayment schedule of $23,500 over 24 months at 0 interest, which is generous given the evidentiary record, and releases all parties from further legal action related to this specific matter. She placed the agreement on the table. The room was quiet for a long time. Stephen Burke said quietly to Rowland, I'd like a moment with my client. Alicia said, of course. I looked at Garrett during the pause. He was looking at the documents on the table with the expression of someone who had just understood, for the first time, the size and shape of the thing they had spent years dismissing. I had seen that expression before, on people in performance reviews when they realized the data didn't support the narrative they had been telling themselves. I said nothing. Patricia said, to no one in particular, I didn't know about the probate record. I looked at her. I said, I know, Mom. She said, I thought Rowland handled it properly. I said, I know. That was the hardest moment in the room, not the documents, not Rowland's expression, not Garrett's silence. It was my mother saying she hadn't known, and me believing her, and the grief of that, the specific grief of understanding that someone can fail you without having chosen to, sitting between us in a conference room with 7 people in it. Stephen Burke and Rowland returned to the table. Stephen Burke said his client was prepared to review the proposed agreement and respond within 7 days. He said Rowland wished to make clear that the situation had not been handled with any intent to harm. Alicia said, the agreement doesn't speak to intent, it speaks to outcome. Rowland signed the agreement 12 days later. The first payment arrived in my account on the 15th of the following month, exactly as scheduled. $23,500 over 24 months. It arrived the same way everything in my professional life had arrived, precisely, documented, and on a timeline I had set. As for Patricia's medical expenses, I paid them. Not because Rowland asked me to, and not as a concession. I paid them because she was my mother, and the cardiac procedure had been necessary, and the insurance policy gap was real, and the $34,000 in medical expenses had nothing to do with what Rowland had done. I called the cardiologist's billing office directly, confirmed the outstanding balance, and arranged a direct payment. I told no one in the Vickers family that I had done it until after it was done. Patricia called me when she found out. She said my name twice. She didn't finish the sentence. I said she should rest and that we would talk more when she was stronger. We have talked more. It has been slow and not without difficulty, but it has been real. Roland did not contest the agreement further. Stephen Burke sent a closing letter confirming the matter resolved. There were no additional legal proceedings. Roland and Garrett have not contacted me since the payment schedule began, except for one email from Garrett 6 months after the December meeting that said simply, "I didn't know about the full history, I should have asked more questions." I read it twice. I did not respond immediately. 3 days later I wrote back, "I know, nothing else, it was enough." At Harwick, the payroll remediation was processed in full over 6 months as agreed. My corrected annual salary of $103,000 took effect on the first of the year following the agreement. Douglas Fairweather signed the written acknowledgement of institutional error personally. Helen Draper told me, in the break room, over the same brand of coffee we had always shared, "You handled that with more professionalism than most people would have." I said I had had a lot of time to think about it. She said, "I know, that's what I mean." Philip Renner implemented a company-wide audit of the deferred adjustment records across all departments. They found 4 other cases with similar status field notations. All 4 were corrected. I was credited, formally, in the memo that went to the board. Terrence Ogilvy left his HR role at the hospital network the following spring and joined a workforce equity consulting firm. He sends me research papers occasionally, and we still argue about salary banding methodology with the same productive friction we developed in Cohort 9. He was the first person I called after the December meeting. He said, "Was it everything you thought it would be?" I thought about it. I said, "It was quieter, and that was better." He said, "Yeah, that's how it usually is." I kept my appointment with Sandra Kowalski in January. We rebuilt the retirement savings trajectory from the corrected salary baseline and discussed the investment property fund again. This time I enrolled. The equity position is modest, but it is growing. Sandra looked at the revised numbers and said, "This is more like it." I said it was. I still go to therapy sessions, once a month now rather than once a fortnight. My therapist, a careful and perceptive woman named Dr. Evelyn Chukwu, said something to me in our January session that I have returned to often. She said, "You spent a long time being precise about everything external, the work, the documents, the timeline. What does it feel like to also be precise about what you want internally?" I said I was working on it. She said that was a good answer. My current title is Director of Operations, Harwick Financial Group. The promotion came 14 months after the payroll remediation was finalized. I lead a team of 11. We run the payroll cycle, the reconciliation process, and the financial disclosure reporting that I built in my 4th year, and that the company has now adopted as a permanent framework. Helen Draper retired in the spring. I spoke at her retirement gathering. I told the story of the error memo and Sylvia Marchetti and the decision to stay at Brayburn instead of taking the Whitfield Partners phone screen, and I said that Helen had been the reason those early instincts had somewhere to land. She looked at me from across the room with the expression she used when she was pleased and didn't want to perform it. That was enough. The paper that I kept in my wallet for 6 years is in a small frame on the bookshelf in my home office. The ink has faded in the crease lines from all the folding and unfolding. The 3 things written on it are still legible. The name Alicia Drummond, the number $23,500, and the phrase, "Operational leverage is the ability to convert fixed process knowledge into scalable institutional power." I did not know, when I wrote those things down at 26 on Doreen Ashby's couch, that I was writing a 9-year plan. I thought I was writing a reminder. But a reminder held long enough becomes something else. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The most powerful position you can occupy is not the one you announce, but the one you are already in when the moment arrives, built in silence, confirmed by documentation, and requiring nothing from the people who doubted you. 2. Institutions do not respond to emotion. They respond to evidence, and the person who arrives with organized, specific witness documentation will always have more authority in a room than the person who arrives with a grievance and a loud voice. 3. Who you are is not determined by who failed to see you. It is determined by what you continued to build in the years they were not looking, and that construction belongs entirely to you. Was I wrong to wait 9 years before saying anything, to watch the payroll data accumulate, to build my records in silence, to let the Vickers family believe they had the upper hand right up until the moment I chose to change that? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.